question for you, Carlos, is CDT has a big stake in the outcomes as well. Is there an opportunity there to, a part of the scorecard, sort of a mutual measurement, not only for the vendor, but CDT's role in these projects and the outcome of these projects? Is that something you've thought about, how you actually rate your own department's performance? Aside from what you said earlier, which were activities you've undertaken to improve performance through processes, through new resources and services that you're providing, but how are you going to measure your department's success as well?
The short answer is we do a continuous evaluation, and as you saw in those hearings, we get rated on a pretty continuous basis by Bureau of State Audit, by the legislature, and our own internal administration. So in terms of rating our own performance, I think really that's something that we would do more internally. I don't know that we'd ask the vendors to rate our performance. Departments certainly give us their perspectives all the time. So we do take their opinions. The other side of that too is, because I thought one of the questions would be, well, do contractors get to rate the state agencies? And we thought about that. We thought, well, really that's kind of our job from an oversight perspective. But beyond that, so you rate them and you give them a D. What does that mean? Does that mean they don't get to put out any more bids?
No bid.
Or does that mean you're not going to bid for them?
No bid.
Right? I mean, so I don't know that necessarily gets you anything to do that. So anyway, so the short answer is we didn't think about incorporating that into part of this system.
You have a peer review process at the end of the project. So is this required for the projects that are reportable right now to have peer at the end regardless? Because I think that gives you the final PIE.
Right. Post-implementation evaluation report. Yeah.
So one is, have we looked at that as part of this overall story, right? Because we're going to have ups and downs in the project. And it's important that at the end of the story that the conclusion has all of the facts. And the peer seems to be well balanced on department did as well as how the vendor did in that. So that's
Sure.
one question. But the other thing is related to, in PAL, you spend a lot of time in stage 1 and 2 talking about business and their justification. But in your scorecard, there's nothing related to business outcomes, which I think might be a criteria that we want to think about, especially as these procurements evolve, where we may see value delivered sooner, that outcomes be also a point that you take into consideration. Because while on time and on budget, within scope and quality all make perfect sense, there's also, at the end of the day, we want to make sure that the business received the benefit that it was trying to achieve. So have you considered measuring that KPI at some level? It may not happen until the end, but something to talk to that, because I think at the end of the day, that's where departments are wanting to get.
Sure. That's good feedback. So let me break that question up into two things. So in terms of the peer, so the peer is part of our oversight process, right? So when you approve a project, when it's all said and done, you also have to do an after-the-fact report, kind of a post-mortem as to how did it go, what went well, what didn't go well, including business value, those sorts of things. So yeah, our intent is to bake this into part of our oversight, right? So if that's part of the process, that'll be part of it. If it's part of stage 8, we're going to ask in stage 3, as we're structuring the RFP or building out the RFP, where are you using the rating system? Show us your governance structure so that we know your steering committee is prepared to address appeals. So we are going to bake it in that regard. In terms of measuring or rating business value, we didn't bake it into this for a couple of reasons. One is, before project, we're going to apply this prospectively, right? So we're not going to go back to projects that are already in flight, but on projects going forward. Those projects are going to have to go through the first 2 stages of the project approval, which are going to be heavily focused on business value and business case and understanding and tying your project to providing that business value. So our assumption, I guess I should put it up there, is that departments will have a pretty good handle on that. So by the time that you as contractors see a bid on the street, it's going to be a lot better structured to actually meet the business value. That's part of the assumption. The other assumption is, I'm not sure how effectively IB&B and IPOC today measure and report on business value, or if it can be reported on throughout the life of a project. Maybe at the very end you can, or maybe as you deliver incremental functionality. So we just thought it was kind of difficult to get a handle on and report effectively on a quarterly basis.
The other thing is, so you've done a 2-year project as an example, and you get to the end, and when it all is said and done, you get an A. So at that point, is the project then just given an A, and the 24 months of what a project is removed, or how do you manage that? Because there are ebbs and flows in projects that need to be taken into consideration. We may be at a C on one quarter and an A for the rest, and at the end of the day, it's all an A. So what then gets put into that book of record?
So the book of record would be 36 months worth of reports on a quarterly basis, right? So the older ones fall off. So our intent would be you publish all 24 months, or all 8 quarters, I guess. Hopefully, if you're looking at this and using it for evaluation, you see, okay, well, they started out here and you saw a continuous improvement. So, but our intent is to report them all. And again, because, getting back to the issue of addressing common project challenges, we have, I hate to say it, but we do have contractors that are really good at the very end, but, throughout the process, they're just not that great. Or that, come in with a bang and start out strong, and then suddenly people drop off the project, they take time backfilling behind people that leave, or, they kind of lose focus, right? So we want to report throughout the life of the project.
I'm curious about, you mentioned moving towards, or letting people move towards agile procurement.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, this feels like the objectivity focus might actually constrain contracting and make it kind of more specific and make things like agile harder if it's very important that your bid is very objective and very scheduled. I'm wondering how you're thinking about that.
In honesty, as we built this, we were building it based on our experience on projects to date, right? Which we've had a few that are agile, but not that many. So one of the things that I think you'll see in this is that we're going to have to continue to evolve this as we gain experience with it. The state, I think, is moving more towards agile development. But even within agile, you have to have certain milestones of performance, right? Or delivery of functionality. You do have to operate according to some schedules, around some costs, and quality certainly. So I think we'll have to tweak it some, but our intent isn't, to say, okay, well, this is going to lock us into a particular development methodology or even a contracting methodology. The other area, just to be honest with you guys, sort of transparent, that we're still trying to figure out, okay, well, how does this work, are in those benefits-based procurements, right, where you don't actually get paid until you actually deliver something. Well, how does that work with the whole cost aspect of it? Does that mean we have to modify our scheduling part of it? So, I fully anticipate we're going to have to tweak this as we go forward.
There was a question earlier that made an assumption that top grade would be meeting contract. There would be a way to exceed expectations.
Sure.
Could you address that?
Yeah, so, as we developed this, we kind of, really liked the idea of a college transcript, right? So that's why we also thought, you need to rate and weight, the level of, what units, how much do units count, right? Like if you sign up for statistics versus a racquetball class, do they weight the same? Do those units count the same? I think Josh used the example, well, if you meet expectations, then it's an A. Really, in most grading, expectations is a C, right? If you do really good or above and beyond, then you go to a B or an A. So we're not necessarily saying that it's going to be A is you just do what you're paid to do. So we'll look into that.
So there is a way to exceed
Yes, I
expectations.
mean that's what we want to incent, right? So you've got to provide some incentive in the rating. And just to be clear, we're still kind of arm wrestling about whether it's going to be an A, B, C, D, F, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we're not quite settled on that yet, but by the time we get ready to pilot it, then we'll have that negotiated out.
And so since the majority of our projects are non-reportable, I suspect that's a lot of small businesses, we see this as a competitive advantage to us to be scored on our projects. So how do we gain that competitive advantage if we're not scored?
We are going to put out policy and we're going to test drive it first on our projects, but that doesn't mean folks can't use it, right? So as an example, at our work group meeting, just earlier this week, after the meeting, one of the departments came up and said, I'm gonna use it. You know, they're not necessarily dealing with reportable projects, so there's nothing to keep them from doing that. And, you know, if you see it as a competitive advantage, encourage that. I certainly would like that. But ultimately, once we do get this thing worked out, I do want to try and get it to all projects. You know, it might be a little bit more of a fight with departments, but, you know, so is Stage Gate 1. We had that for even non-reportable projects. And
It's certainly not a rating type situation, but service contracts are required to be looked at, and it's almost like a postcard type thing that the Department of General Services has for customers to send back to the legal office, the Office of Legal Services in the Department of General Services, with comments. And it isn't really a scoring or rating type system, but it certainly is a system where there's some check boxes on whether it met the need, whether it met the expectations or did not. So they're already doing something. I don't believe it's recorded anywhere. And hopefully we will work together with them, especially in the reportable project area, for all the ancillary contracts to ensure that small businesses and our disabled veteran businesses get to be part of this performance area too.
It sounds like this is going to really drive quite a bit more collaboration throughout the project lifecycle between the contractor and the state, hoping to increase communication and ensure that the scoring is where it needs to be from the contractor's perspective. I know a lot about the project management side. How are you approaching the contract management and ensuring the change order process, the task management process, all of those measurements along the way are aligning with the project so that the contract stays intact?
in a couple of ways. Before we brought this out to the work group, we had a pretty good discussion with our oversight division. And, you know, I made it clear to them, this is gonna rely a lot on them and their ability to, one, measure, monitor, and ensure that that a project and a department have the proper mechanisms in place to make something like this work. So everything from good governance to even, you know, how do you manage, what should you be looking for in contract management. The Project Academy series that I showed earlier in the slide, a lot of those sessions were specifically around contract management. One of the things you'll see here on Next Steps is training, right? So as we develop this and start rolling it out, one of the things that we're gonna have to do is develop guidelines and training and policies for department staff, and how do you use this, and who does the rating, and how would it work? So that's an area that Ben and Marnell's team will have to participate in. And then also as you go through stage gate, when we talk about assessing a department's capacity to take on a project, or, you know, to structure a procurement, those are some of the things that we look at. So I think there's probably 2 or 3 different ways that we're getting to making sure that from the contract management perspective, one, that they know how to write a contract, that they know how to actually use a contract and keep to it, to document changes to it, because we know, you know, contracts need to change, evolve, and that they have the capacity within the agency to actually do that. And then our oversight folks will be asked to monitor that as part of their oversight responsibilities.
Are we going to get an opportunity to see some of the details of how this is going to get put into place before you put it into place? Because I think a lot of the concepts are difficult to understand and really assess the impact of at this level. To the point earlier of, you know, is an A meeting requirements of the contract, or is an A exceeding?
Sure.
That could make a big difference. How do you evaluate cost performance when on most contracts, cost could only increase with a mutually agreed change order? And so would you be penalized if there are a lot of change orders on the project, or is there other different kinds of change orders?
So our intent is, you know, to take the feedback we've gotten today, make some tweaks to it, and then bring it back out in a pilot. Right, so I think that's probably gonna be your first opportunity to see, okay, how does it actually work in practice? How does it work baked into an RFO or an RFP and baked into a contract? We'll have contract language and those sorts of things. So I think you'll get a chance to see it there. To your second question though, I'm not sure that I agree with you on cost only changes through a mutually agreed upon change order. I think that's usually the result. but it doesn't always start there, right? Ultimately, the state has to move in a certain direction, or the project has to go in a certain way from a cost perspective for a number of different reasons. Sometimes, again, it's driven by us, sometimes it's driven by the contractor. So I think what we will be looking at is what is the root cause of the change. I won't name the project, but as an example, one of the things that ended up driving cost on a project that I was involved with was that the contractor had really just not staffed up to the level that they needed, and so things were taking longer. We were running out of runway on some of our older contracts. We had to switch to different versions of hardware and software because what they proposed wasn't actually up to par on the job, right? Now, in the end, it resulted in a change order, which the state did sign off on, but I wouldn't say that that was mutually agreed to because it was a mutual accountability for that. So, I mean, we're gonna have to get into what's behind it. That's part of the reason, when showing how it all work out, that one of the first things that we ask the rater to do is say, okay, assess, what's the cause of this? Where did this come from? I think we're gonna fumble our way through some of it initially, but I think that's where IBMB, where ITalk will actually be a good resource and a tool for the people doing the rating and for the contractor too, right? Because a lot of times they're able to back up that, well, no, the problem is really on the state's end of it. Anyway, I hope that answers the question.
I've, worked on both sides of the aisle, as far as in a department and from a control agency perspective. And when you're in a department, I don't know, none of you have ever been shy about going to the people in charge or the leadership of an organization and ensuring that the people running the project or in the project are doing the right thing and the right job. Suppliers always have input into leadership and governance, the governance people and those kinds of things. So I'm sure that none of this will be a surprise when the ratings are completed and been appealed or standing.
My question is about the aggregation of scores amongst affiliated companies, where companies have, for example, separate Secretary of State registration, separate tax ID numbers, but we're all owned by a common corporate parent. Is your intent to keep our scores separate or aggregate us even though we're separate corporations?
That's a good question. It's one that we haven't quite figured out how we're gonna do that yet, but ultimately what we wanna be able to do is to identify which companies are doing business with us in California, right? So if you have multiple Xerox, Incorporated, or Xerox LLC, or Xerox, services, or whatever else, we need to be able to take that into account. We don't have that part figured out yet, to be honest with you.
So Fiscal is, one of the great things that this system provides us is individual suppliers and our supplier database, right? I think it's the 205, I don't know what the numbers are because we don't have to worry about numbers anymore. Because Fiscal has kind of taken us to the next, hopefully to the next level. One of the things that we have discussed is the fact that wouldn't it be great if our vendor rating system and how suppliers are put into Fiscal, if it eventually would all mesh together and we could have access as to what suppliers are, not just their scoring, but who all's doing business with them in the state, what kinds of services they're selling, what the dollar values are, and really have a portfolio out there for our different suppliers. And we hope that Fiscal will help us get there by having a uniform data about suppliers in it. So I think we can look forward to that too.
With regard to the pilot of the rating system and your evaluation of the results, when do you anticipate that will occur? And what are your thoughts around exposing to industry what those results are and exposing to industry what your evaluation of those results are?
I think probably after the first of the year, we're gonna be looking for a good candidate procurement to bake this into. And in terms of when do we anticipate evaluating the results. I think a lot will depend on how does that procurement go and, what's the schedule for that particular project. I would anticipate probably 6 to 9 to 12 months to get the evaluation done, and we might do multiples, right? It might not be just one pilot. We got to see what's out there. And in terms of exposing it back to the vendor community, we're going to obviously make tweaks and changes. I'm pretty sure your tech associations are going to be monitoring and asking us to come in and share with them, so we'll be happy to do that. I'm pretty sure the legislature will ask us to come in and share how it's going with this as well. So I would anticipate some level of reporting or hearings or something around it as well. In terms of timing, it will depend on which procurements we actually pilot with and what the schedule is for those.
Remember, the transparency's sake, evaluation and what we're exactly going to be doing is put in the RFP, and so that all suppliers can comment. I know many of you, again, provide us great comments to ensure that the bid itself is understandable and that the evaluation is transparent and those kinds of things. So we always appreciate your feedback, and it will be outlined in the bid document, whether that be an RFP, an IFB, whatever, RFO, whatever it is. And you will have an opportunity to provide us feedback, as you always do.
Our intent again is to pilot the system, take the results and integrate them. Some of the things that we'll be evaluating initially is it workable? Are people actually able to rate it or not? In terms of evaluating, does it improve performance on projects or outcomes on projects? Some of that evaluation might take a bit longer, right? The other thing that we're going to do is develop training. Obviously, a couple of you asked about that one. Will these people actually know how to use it, or are they positioned to use it? So training for the state agencies, and again, back out to contractors, so that, Mark, would be another opportunity to see, well, here's how it actually works and how it will be applied. And then at some point, we're going to drop a policy that says, okay, here's a rating system, here's how you use it, and you're required to use it on these types of procurements or these types of projects. Contract language as well. Once we get through our pilot, then our intent is to implement, publish the scores, and at some point down the road to automate this process so that as reports and scores are reported, it just becomes a faster and easier to publish them and make it easier for people to go in and search and to do things like average ratings or figure out, okay, all the companies that are XYZ, whether it's Inc. or LLC or XYZ services, so that they can go in and have an easier access to the information. Other questions?
It sounds like the rating itself is going to be mandatory for the portable projects, but the scoring impact, the ratings impact on the actual bid seems to be undefined at this point. Maybe that's something to get into. But in the real world, I think that you also said you didn't think the ratings would add to a particular score in the evaluation, and that it couldn't necessarily bar a vendor from participating in the bid. But if there is an actual points given, 1,000 points for a bid, and the vendor with an A gets 900, and the one with a B gets a 950, where does that rating, how does that impact that score? Could the lower bid with the better rating win?
So I think what I was saying is we're not going to mandate how specifically it's used in each evaluation. I think what we will mandate is you will use it in the evaluation. In terms of, could it preclude a vendor from bidding? If an organization says, hey, I really want somebody that's got this level of performance, they may not consider your bid if your rating is below that level, right? If you're a consistent bid performer, they might not include you, or that may preclude you from bidding on that particular bid. What I was saying is, I don't know that we'll get to the point where we say, okay, if in 36 months you haven't gotten above a D- or a C-, then you can't bid on state contracts. That's what I was saying. I'm not sure that we'll do that. So the flexibility that we're going to provide is, as you structure a bid, as you structure an RFP evaluation, we'll work with the agency to figure out, okay, how do you use the system? Do you add points for good grades? Do you deduct points for bad grades? Do you only look at ratings for companies that are in this demographic? Are you allowed to preclude anybody who doesn't meet a minimum level of performance? So it's not that it's undefined, it's just, we're not gonna mandate specifically, especially right now, since we haven't even piloted it, how folks are gonna use it, but they are gonna use it. Another good part of, or a good reason to pilot it, figure out, does it work and is it workable? And also a good reason to keep it simple and straightforward.
Is this going to be for IT and non-IT service contracts, or for all, or is this just for IT and your?
We're gonna start with reportable IT, and I guess if you talk about non-IT, like support contracts for projects, those.
Yeah, like the EDG project, or that's
Sure.
a non-IT project.
So I'll just tell you my personal bias. I consider those pretty much IP projects as well. I mean, we get the same level of scrutiny and results, and you need a system to provide that service. So my hope and my intent is to use it for those as well. If you're talking about other things like constructing roads or, things like that, that's not within our jurisdiction.
You mentioned earlier that if a vendor has multiple projects, each would be rated, weighted, and averaged. Is that meant that a vendor will have a singular grade associated with their firm? Or will there be any delineation between, let's call it within IT projects, the types of projects that they do, whether measured in difference by size, complexity, who does maybe pure technology, hardware and software contract along with IT services, et cetera?
You're not gonna like the answer. It's yes and no. They each will be rated. That is true. We'll rate each engagement, each contract. They will be weighted, not necessarily that we'll say, okay, Department of Technology is going to publish a grade for Deloitte, and the cumulative grade is B+. What we will do is we'll have each of those grades there. Now, where it might be rated or averaged or weighted is when we're doing a bid evaluation, right? As we're structuring an RFP for a new system to, build a housing allocation system or whatever else, they may go in and say, okay, well, we're going to rate and average or weight the individual scores of companies. We're not going to provide a cumulative grade on our website, if you will. We will be, our intent is to make it searchable so somebody can go in and say, okay, let's see all the ratings that Deloitte has.
So theoretically, though, I could be an agency who is letting this new housing solicitation, and I could do a search for, I want to know the grades across the community for firms that have done that particular kind of work or some
Right.
level of.
Or, like I said, it could be anybody who's bid on a housing system, or anybody who's, done a project of $50 million to $100 million.
Right.
So it's going to be important to note that in the beginning, it will be by project.
Yeah.
So if ABC Company has done 12 projects, they're going to be 12 quarterly grades or points that's weighted by the degree of difficulty, that kind of thing. But it will be separate in their same file for that, the name of that company, probably based on something like Fiscal for the data repository name, so that it can all be pulled together when we automate. We need to be, forward thinking as to where we want to go in the future. So we are going to look at all that. But it's going to be like project, probably Excel spreadsheet rows that eventually we're going to track the data that eventually can be automated.
How are you going to handle mergers and acquisitions with companies?
Yeah, that's a good question.
And same thing with divestitures.
Yeah, I think probably have to keep the ratings there until they roll off, right? Keep them on for 36 months. And then, again, in the evaluation, folks are gonna have to be aware of, hey, we just bought this company.
We're not going to change all the way we do business today. So there's already contracting terms and conditions about what happens with acquisitions and name changes and all of those kinds of things. So we will still have to follow the current processes and the terms and conditions that DGS has out there for us. This again is evaluation of the supplier community on the projects, and as the other rules apply in the contract, those will lead us to how those names are rolled in or where those companies' names go. Because there's already processes in place for that.
You know, the collaborative approach on a lot of the teams that are developing ITRPs or something along those lines requires multiple approvals for a specific deliverable or milestone. So for example, you might have the agency, the project manager, IPOC and IB&V, and maybe control agencies might all weigh in on and have an approval step for developing sections of the RFP, for example.
But I don't think they all get approval on it. You might get the agency in our department.
Sometimes that approval process can frequently take a while, and it's often outside the vendor's control. I'm trying to understand if there is enough flexibility in the system around the timeliness criteria and the schedule criteria to accommodate the fact that you're often helping socialize the decision-making process in order to get a consensus in terms of what needs to go out as part of the deliverable.
Are you asking if you're a company helping an agency to put together an RFP?
I'm using that as an example. I actually think it applies to a variety of different projects, but yeah, using that as an example. Is that approval process that can involve multiple state entities and roles taken into account in the assessment process?
Really, when we're looking at the project approval life cycle and we're looking at all of the gates, it is a collaborative effort, and it's very important that it remain collaborative. We each have our roles though. So oversight has its role and the things it's looking at from a project oversight, IB&V type of environment, what they're looking for. Procurement, I'm not going to approve something where I can't tell how it's going to be evaluated, or whether the scope of work ensures that we're making payments at the appropriate or proper time. So there's certain things that each of us in our own discipline are looking at, and you will find that with the customers, the departments, and us being, and the control agencies, many times there are discussions. But I can guarantee you that if I'm taking too long to review something, that my boss and my boss's boss are being told. So, and that then gets taken care of. So much of the discussion, I think, as a consultant, probably helping a department write an RFP or write something up to go out to bid, much of that is like a team discussion, and it just those are the things that happen as people are making decisions and collaborating and working as a team. But once you have a document and you want it approved, there's a time period. And nobody lets me take more time than is allocated.
The appeals process that I was talking about, so one of the determinations is it on the state? Part of the problem is the approval process takes so long, and then that's on the state.
At last week's industry forum, he said, in effect, that the scorecard would be your references. So is that to be taken literally, that the existing referencing system, the Qual system, will be going away or superseded?
I think what he was saying is one of the challenges contractors have is getting agencies to be referenceable. A lot of agencies just won't, right? And so that's a challenge. He said this might help. This might be a way of giving those references. I don't think he was trying to imply this takes the place of what we put in. It could be a supplement.
The reference portion of evaluation is really difficult. It's difficult for the suppliers, but it's also very difficult for the state entities because of, we ask certain questions, we want to verify that those are correct. People, you can't get a hold of people, they don't call you back, they've moved on, nobody else wants to speak to that project because it was done before their time. So again, I believe this eventually will be a win-win in that respect.
Appreciate your input. Thank you very much.